You no doubt saw some of the coverage last week of the first anniversary of the events of January 6, 2021. Many of us watched in astonishment a year ago as the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. came under attack. Someone who probably wasn't surprised was Canadian author Stephen Marche, who has been predicting a second American Civil War for some time. He characterizes what he thinks is coming in his new book, The Next Civil War: Dispatches from the American Future. And with that, we welcome Stephen Marche back to our program from Seton Village in Ontario's capital city. Stephen, it's good to see you again. How are you doing?
Good to see you too.
Let's start by me putting to you a quote that is in your book. This is from retired U.S. Army Colonel Peter Mansour, who said, "It would not be like the first Civil War with armies maneuvering on the battlefield," he says. "I think it would very much be a free-for-all, neighbor on neighbor, based on beliefs and skin colors and religion, and it would be horrific." Well, that certainly sets the scene. And my first question for you is, how much, in your view, did Donald Trump's presidency contribute to your sense of an impending civil war?
Very little, to be honest. I think one of the aspects of this book is trying to get below the sort of horse race politics that dominates coverage. You know, what Marjorie Taylor Greene's Twitter feed is saying, or what Ted Cruz did or didn't do on Fox News. And Donald Trump, of course, was the master of that kind of, aggressive politics. The trends here are really deep. I think the thing I found really hardest to explain, particularly to liberal Americans, is that I believe everything in this book would have happened if Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016.
Okay, that's a fascinating insight, but let me put it this way. I'm a lot older than you, and I was alive for the assassinations of Martin
Indeed.
Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. You don't have to rub it in. But anyway, I do remember when
You
political
brought it up.
assassination, when political assassination seemed far too frequent. It was horrific. And yet America did not descend into a civil war at that time, even though it sure looked like it might happen. Why do you think what we're seeing today could lead to worse?
Well, the 60s were very dramatic, and there were, of course, major conflicts, and 140 cities burned after the assassination of MLK. And political assassination is very common in American history. Basically 1 out of 11 presidents have been assassinated, a little less now. But to compare that, Britain has only had 1 prime minister assassinated. So, as one Secret Service agent said to me, assassination is part of the political process in the United States. What's changed now, what's different from the 60s, is that the institutions are no longer prepared to deal with the fallout from violence. So you don't have the same legitimacy of the political institutions. You don't have the same legitimacy in the legal institutions. If you take an event like Watergate, in hindsight, that was evidence of the system working. You had a press that investigated corruption. You had an audience that believed the press. You had politicians who then needed to respond to the mass sense of corruption. And then from that, you had, political legal action from both parties. None of that would happen today. That's why America is so much more vulnerable. It's because its institutions are in decline.
Now, it seems to me back in the day, the biggest cleavage in the United States, or one of them anyway, was sort of left versus right. And today, it feels to me, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree, it seems to me the biggest cleavage is sane versus insane. Does that make civil war more likely?
Yes, but it's really important to remember that your sane and the other side's sane are totally opposites, right? They also regard the insanity as taking over, but from the other side. You have people who are in complete disagreement about basic facts, about the basic role of government, about what freedom means. And ultimately, what this civil war is about, or will be about, is about the meaning of America. And that struggle kind of is permanent. So, yeah, I think it's not a debate over policy. It's a debate about very, very fundamental questions about the nature of, the country itself.
We talked a second ago about the role of assassination in American political history, and I do want to follow up on that a bit right now. And I have to say, you did write a chapter in this book that basically describes the characteristics that you believe the next presidential assassin will have and how he will do it. And it is a he, as you suggest. And okay, why'd you put all that in the book? Let's start there.
Well, I mean, what I wanted to capture through these imagined scenarios is how, it's a way of sort of giving a hook to various different kind of abstract categories. So one of those categories is hyperpartisanship, where Americans don't want their children to marry people of other parties. The hatred really drives engagement. Like hatred is the number one way that politics works in America now, and that hatred bubbles up at the same time as you have the rise of what the experts call stochastic terrorism, which is self-generating terrorists, and so it was a way of kind of capturing that reality. Also, I think the really important part of that book is not that a presidential assassination is possible. That's always been true in American history. I think what it shows is that if a president were to be assassinated, it would be almost impossible for there to be national unity around it. Half the country would probably regard it as a good thing, and the other half probably wouldn't. And that when you think about the 60s, like when JFK was assassinated, it was genuinely treated as a national catastrophe, and that could not be said about the presidencies of Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Barack Obama, for that matter.
No, and in fact, the same thing happened, whatever it was, 41, almost 42 years ago, when the attempt was made on Ronald Reagan's life. And it didn't matter if you were a Republican or a Democrat at that time. Everybody was mortified by that instance. But I guess what I'm getting at with the question is you do go into some detail about why you think the assassin will do what he will do, how he will do what he will do. And I just wonder if you had any nervousness about putting that much specificity about, after all, something that is a rather taboo topic out there for public display.
Why would it be bad to produce models those are models that are drawn from the best available models of terrorism? I don't think confronting the possibility of that reality can be negative. I mean, putting your head in the sand when it comes to America is, this is not a good option. This is not going to lead to better outcomes. It's not like suddenly pretending that there isn't this violence out there is not going to diminish the violence at all.
What do you think the assassin's motive would be?
Well, I mean, it would be political loathing of a really profound way, and the book goes into real specifics of the psychological characteristics that tend to make up terrorists. Senses of loss, senses of personal grandeur. They actually have incredibly strong models for the psychological makeup of assassins and political rioters and so on. And, it was just an attempt to recreate what that would look like. Like, they have the model. I sort of kind of put flesh on the bones and make it feel like what it would actually look like if it happened.
And just to be clear, you don't worry you're putting any ideas in people's heads?
Oh no, the ideas are out there. The idea that I'm contributing to that, I mean, those people are already out there, and you know what? They're not reading the effete essays of Toronto journalists. Like that's not their primary cultural consumption. Is like me.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Thank you for setting the table for the discussion to come, Stephen, because we are going to bring some other voices into our conversation right now. They are all joining us from the American Capitol. So let's welcome Julie Wronski, who is a professor at the University of Mississippi, specializing in political psychology and American politics. Nate Hochman, who's the ISI Fellow at the National Review and Novak Fellow at the Fund for American Studies. And Dylan Matthews, who's a senior correspondent at the news and opinion website Vox. And we welcome all you three as well to our conversation about Stephen Marsh's new book, of which I'd like to read another excerpt to propel us to the next area of our conversation. Here's what Stephen writes. America is becoming two Americas, Americas that hate each other, that don't speak to each other. No one occupies the middle ground anymore. Everyone has separated into one side or the other, one party or the other, no matter what they may claim. Okay, I just want to get the three of you, generally speaking, on the thesis of this book, which is basically the next civil war is coming. And if we want to avoid it, there are some steps pretty significant that need to be taken. Julie, can you comment on that, please?
Hi, yes. So first, thank you for having me on the show. So I want to draw on some of my own research that looks at partisan divisions in the United States and how we think about partisans and how we think about fellow citizens as being either American or un-American. And a lot of my research finds that there is a small but non-trivial, significant portion of Americans who think about their fellow citizens, especially out-party citizens, as un-American, maybe around the magnitude of 15 to 20%. So this is somewhat disturbing that we're thinking about people that technically are citizens as these un-American foreign threats. And that's fairly dangerous to having national community, especially in a time of a national pandemic like COVID-19. So I am definitely concerned that there are these divisions set up. We see a lot of partisan sorting where each political party is increasingly characterized by one set of people that is defined by race, religion, geography, gender, values, and ideology. So we are seeing the two parties are very different across the aisle in terms of who they represent, what they believe in, and where they live. So in some ways, a lot of on the ground, the public opinion and the partisan composition of America really does align with Stephen Marsh's premise.
I take your point on all that, but I guess the definition of civil war that Stephen uses in his book is that we are going to at some point see hundreds, if not thousands, of people killed every day because, taken to its logical extent, not every day? How often, Stephen?
No. The technical marker for a civil war is 1,000 combatant deaths a year.
Okay, significant difference.
That's what an insurgent conflict looks like. Yeah, it's not thousands of deaths a day.
All right, in which case, Julie, can you imagine that happening in your country?
I mean, in some ways, aren't we already there? How do we define combatant? How do we define violence? When do school shootings or mass shootings or homicides count into that threshold? You know, as Stephen called it, he called it a stochastic fighting, these kind of uncoordinated individual attacks. So if we start relabeling or reconceptualizing a lot of the violence we already see in America in these terms, we might actually be fairly close to Stephen's threshold of that 1,000 deaths. So in some ways it is definitional, but it's also in some ways, because it's not coordinated, it might already be appearing in ways that are natural. So say something like January 6th might already be at that threshold. And it doesn't take a lot of people. You know, if it only takes 1,000 or 10,000 people to have violence to meet this threshold, we might be there. That's a fraction of the American population.
No, that's a good point to put on the record here, is that it's not, if there is a next civil war, it's not going to be like the blue and the gray of the 1860s, where people line up and start shooting at each other with muskets. It's going to be for the 21st century. And I guess, Nate, I want to get you on the record now as to what your view is of the thesis being put forward by Stephen Marsh.
Well, look, I agree with Stephen's take that institutional breakdown has a lot to do with the divisions in America today. And I think things are getting really bad in America. Whether or not we are on our way to a civil war, I think, is certainly open for debate. I don't think we're at a point where we're at a civil war yet. January 6th, for example, was less than 10 deaths. The BLM riots the summer before were, somewhere in the ballpark of about 50 deaths, although there's a lot of destruction. So we're seeing an enormous amount of civic breakdown, certainly, and we're seeing a loss of trust in our institutions. That could go a lot of different ways, though. And you've seen countries that go through this process before without descending fully into civil war. So I think I'm slightly more optimistic, if not naive, than Stephen is. I would just add, though, that I think the breakdown in confidence in our institutions, the context that needs to be added there, is a large part of that is the result of the behavior of the people who run our institutions themselves. There's a lot of talk in DC circles, for example, that about sort of the problem with a declining trust in institutions. There's not as much self-reflection as I'd like to see from the actual people who are running our institutions about exactly what their role was in declining trust. I mean, I think that has to be a large part of the conversation. The divisions between Americans today aren't just left-right. They are an insular upper class of about the upper 1/3 of American society and middle America. And I think that those divisions have been exacerbated by people at the top behaving in ways that alienate middle Americans, and then turning around and lecturing middle Americans about not having confidence in their institutions. So part of these divisions, I think, have to do with the fact that the institutional authorities that we traditionally look to as a source of expertise, a source of authority on any number of things, have ruined their own legitimacy with a large swath of Americans. And any sort of path to national renewal and healing has to take that into account.
Okay. Dylan, let me get you on the record as to whether you think America could be headed for another civil war.
I don't find civil war to be a useful term for the kind of civic conflict that we have in the United States right now, especially because of the specific historical context in the United States. Often in these discussions, people like Stephen or the political scientist Barbara Walter, who has been very vocal in raising alarms about a potential second civil war, will be careful to state that they're talking about something like an insurgent conflict, something like 1,000 deaths per year, as Stephen said. Walter has drawn analogies to something like the Troubles in Northern Ireland. In an American political context, people understand the word civil war to mean something rather specific, which is sort of armies on battlefields mobilized by states. The first American Civil War killed 2.5% of the American population. The equivalent today would be something like 7 million Americans being killed in armed conflict. There just isn't evidence, to my eyes, that enough Americans support violence of that scale, that the kind of breakdown is so sectional and regional as it was in the 1860s. If you look at a province like Quebec, there's no analog in the United States for the kind of sovereigntist nationalist movement of CAQ or PQ. There's no Californian sovereigntist movement. There's no Texas sovereigntist movement. And most of the cleavages are internal to states. It's Austin versus rural Texas. It's San Francisco versus Humboldt County. And so am I concerned about low-level violence, assassinations? Yes, though I think it's important, as you said, Steve, to point out that in the 1960s, sort of the absolute rates of those things were much higher. And while the deaths of people like JFK were mourned as tragedies, the deaths of people like Malcolm X or Martin Luther King Jr. were not universally mourned as tragedies and were celebrated in certain quarters. So I don't think the situation is as bad as it was in the mid-1960s, the early 1970s, when you were averaging about 5 mostly non-lethal bombings a day in the United States, mostly from political groups. But I certainly don't want to diminish the importance of polarization in American society right now. I just think that sort of alarmism and use of the term civil war specifically in an American context is not an accurate reflection of the current state of play.
Well, Stephen, you've had to defend yourself against the use of the term civil war in the past, and you just heard the word alarmist used in relation to it. Do you want to defend yourself on that?
Well, I mean, I've been called alarmist in a lot of, from the very beginning, and I'm still called alarmist today. But, I mean, the thing is, the unimaginable keeps happening. Like you would say, if you'd gone back 5 years ago and said there'll be tanks on the streets of Washington on July 4th, no one would have believed you. But that happened. I mean, I was on your show saying the militias are coming and being roundly attacked for it, and 6 months before January 6th happened. So, I'm used to this process. I would take Dylan's point seriously, though. Like, we're not talking about the Civil War. I don't think anyone is talking about the level of destruction of the first Civil War. We're talking about insurgency. Exactly that. It is America is so big and so diverse, both in terms of population and in terms of geography, that historical analogs really, in its own history or in anyone else's history, are really hard to get to. And, in the book, I do get at that. Like, when you're talking to these military experts about what it would be like to occupy the United States, there's no real model because, no country is like America. No country's ever been like America. What I'm talking about is large-scale political violence. And I do think it's correct to fear large-scale political violence, like not small amounts, and the inability of the government to create order for it. And, I mean, I would say about the point that, these elites have to take responsibility for their for this decline in institutions. That's true as far as it goes. I think when you see the inability to even mourn a Capitol police officer, where they literally can't get together to mourn somebody who has died protecting them. When you see, like, from a Canadian point of view, the fact that basic government functions have become ludicrous high stakes games, like the appointment of diplomats, the constant flirting around reneging on the debt, which is, just totally insane. And then, the Build Back Better bill, which is essentially a budget. I mean, that's a Wednesday in most mature democracies. That's true. But, there are real structural problems too here. Like, by 2040, the estimates suggest that about 30% of the population will control 68% of the Senate. Another way of putting that is 50% of the population will control 84% of the Senate. And already you have a Supreme Court where 5 out of 9 justices were not selected by a president who won the popular mandate. And when they make a decision on abortion, whichever way it goes, half the country will feel it's illegitimate. That's no one's fault. That's a problem with structure. And I mean, to me, when I look at American politics, what I see is not, we need better leaders. If only we could get moderate Republicans in. If only we could figure something out. It's more like, this system is very antiquated. It's 240 years old. Jefferson said you should only have a constitution for 19 years. It's time to get another one, basically.
Well, we'll talk in a bit about how that might potentially happen. But I wonder, Julie, if I can go back to this issue of sane versus insane as part of what led us to this moment. I mean, there is and I can't tell you what the percentage is, but there's a chunk of the Republican Party today that believes that Jewish space lasers started forest fires in California, which adversely affected that state. Now, how did it get to this?
So one thing that the political science tells us is that we think about new information and we approach new information through the lenses of the groups and identities we already have. So this means that if you're a Democrat, you're going to look at Democrat and left-leaning news articles and trust them more. If you're a Republican, you're going to look at those elites and those trusted sources and follow those leaders. And again, this might get to the point that was made about the institutions and the elites, that if the elites are polarizing and if the elites are telling people different stories or different aspects of reality, people are going to look at information to defend their identities. You're going to look at information to say, well, if I'm a Republican and my trusted Republican news source tells me this, I'm going to believe it. And in some ways, that might explain a bit more of the polarization we're seeing, especially in areas like social media, where there's a way bigger variety of news sources or just information sources that exist in the world. And so it's really important to understand that when people start defending certain positions, if it sounds sane versus insane, in some ways, this is more about people defending their own ego and their own sense of, I'm in a group and I want my group to be right and I don't want my group to be proven wrong. And once you start believing things in defense of your own identity, you get entrenched.
Okay, Stephen says in the book, and Nate, I'll bring you in on this. Stephen says in the book that violence could very well start at the hands of, I guess, what might be called the armed militant wing of the Republican Party. What's your view on that?
Well, look, I know I'm the conservative on the panels, but I have to say I think the problem with this discussion and this narrative in general is that it is largely one-sided and partisan. I mean, Stephen was talking earlier about the problem with a lack of belief in our institutions, and certainly, not failing to celebrate a fallen Capitol police officer is a big deal. But there's an entire other side of this equation that's being missed, which is the misbehavior of the left-leaning elite. You have everything from the Kamala Harris, who's now the vice president of the United States, raising bail funds for people who were arrested for violent crimes during BLM riots in 2020, to people like Anthony Fauci admitting that they lied multiple times to Americans about any number of things throughout the pandemic, to public health officials.
Well, hang on, Nate, I got to jump in there. I don't recall Anthony Fauci admitting several times that he lied during the course of the pandemic.
That's not true. So he lied about masks. He flip-flopped. He apologized for it later, and he told the New York Times 2 months ago.
Hang on, lied? I don't know about
Yes.
I don't know about down in Washington, but in Canada, when you use a word like lie, that means that he knowingly put out false information for the purposes of deceiving people. Is that what we're saying?
Anthony Fauci on herd immunity said that Americans weren't ready to hear the actual herd immunity numbers. He said, originally, I said that they were 60% when the polls showed that most Americans didn't want to get vaccinated. Then I bumped it up to 75 to 80% when the poll numbers started to go up. He literally said, I don't think Americans were ready to hear the truth. If that isn't lying, I really don't know what the definition of lying is. I mean, but this is a repeated pattern. Anthony Fauci is indicative of a larger failure of a largely left-leaning elite that lacks self-awareness, frankly. I mean, with all due respect to Stephen, you can't in one breath talk about a loss of failure or a failure of confidence in our institutions, and then in the next breath, essentially call the Supreme Court illegitimate and say that we need a new constitution, right? You can't do the two things at the same time. You have an American ruling class, but you are part of a opinion-making class that spans borders.
I'm a Canadian.
And you write for American
I'm not
publications.
part of America at all.
And there is a declining trust in our institutions, largely because we have an American class of rulers who has essentially given up on our institutions, who doesn't believe in the Constitution, who don't believe that the American system of government is legitimate, who never accepts Republican presidents, right, from George Bush to Donald Trump as legitimate in the first place, and then complain when Republicans say that elections are illegitimate, right? This is the part of the equation that's missed when you talk about American politics. Certainly, you can point to any number of things that right-wing and Republican elites do that are worthy of condemnation. But you got to get your own house in order first, and particularly given the fact that all of America's governing institutions, with the exception sometimes of Congress and the White House, are controlled by people on the left. The left needs to look at itself and figure out what it's doing wrong before it starts to sort of lecture Americans in red America about what they're doing wrong.
Okay, Stephen, come on in on that.
My house is Canada. My house is not the Democratic Party, which doesn't represent me in any way, either in identity terms or in political terms. Like, they're not even an enemy to me. Like, just to be clear, like, I don't want to stop you because you're really making my point for me. But don't you guys think there's no point in fighting over this stuff? Like, if we're all in agreement that the institutions are illegitimate. And where that illegitimacy comes from in the largest scale is kind of irrelevant. I mean, if you're looking at it from historical terms, if you look at the sociology, like the rise of the militias, the rise of the violence, and just to be clear, like 94% of political violence in the United States comes from the right. There are left-wing people who do it, but they're much smaller than the right. They're much less of a threat, and you can find that research really across the spectrum. The reason, if you really want to go back to it, it comes from 2008 and the crash of the housing market and the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you're right, an American elite that is completely not worthy of trust. Like, there's no question that that's right. But when you say get your house in order, America's your house. Like that's the house you need to get in order, not the house of not the other guy's party, not your party. You need to get a system where even if you lose, you feel like your government is legitimate. Stephen Harper was my prime minister. I wrote against him. I attacked him. It got nasty sometimes, but I never for a moment felt that he was not Canadian or that he was not a legitimate steward of the Canadian people, right? So here is the point: when you cannot agree on did Fauci lie, it's probably not worth even debating when you don't have a framework where a real answer can emerge from. It's just more screaming.
Okay, Dylan, come on in here and let me get your take on what you've just heard.
I'm more sympathetic to Nate on this than I think people might suspect. I do think there were massive messaging failures by the CDC and the FDA early in the pandemic, and that worsened trust in institutions, which I think is a pattern you see throughout American history. If you look at polls asking Americans if they trust the government, the big decline happened in the wake of Vietnam, and especially the Church Committee, which investigated the CIA and intelligence services and found they were doing things like secret attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, unauthorized surveillance on Americans at home, LSD testing on unsuspecting civilians. That was bad behavior that correctly reduced America's trust in the institutions that did it. But we're somewhat far afield from the question of how this translates into violent conflict. And I think it's important to remember that when political scientists have tried to poll Americans on how sympathetic they are to violence, there were a few papers on this this past year from a team at Stanford and a team at Dartmouth. Support for actual violence is incredibly low. And some of that is social desirability bias. You don't want to tell researchers that you're actually really gung-ho about violence. But some of it is also about misperception. There's been some research suggesting that when you give accurate information on how few of their neighbors support political violence, Americans become less likely to support political violence. And that fits with some of what we know about civil wars in other contexts. War is incredibly costly. No one rationally would want to settle a dispute over war rather than through a negotiated settlement. The costs are almost always higher. And so when war does break out, it tends to be because of a sort of paranoid arms race between sides where one feels like they need to build up on arms and prepare for war because they assume the other is. And part of my worry about this discourse is that it might contribute to a sense, and I'm not attacking Stephen personally here. He's one writer. This is a much larger discussion in the United States that he's partaking in. But I don't want the sense among Americans to be, well, a civil war is coming whether I like it or not, so I better learn how to use an AR-15 and get ready for it. My worry is that dynamic can have a corrosive impact and might sort of exacerbate some of the very trends we're trying to fight against in this discussion.
Well, Dylan, you've led us nicely to where we want to go next, which is to say some people are asking right now whether America might not be better off engaging in a massive divorce. And to that end, I want to bring a map up here that is in Stephen Marsh's book that basically shows an America that would be broken up into several different countries. Let me ask our director, Sheldon Osman, if he can bring that up.
This is
I get it. Let's do a little spitballing here.
That's just a rough idea. This is just a rough idea. And it says that in the book. It says that.
Okay. Stephen, I take your admonition to heart, but let's just take a look. And for those who are listening on podcast and who can't see the map, let me just describe it a little bit. If we go west to east, you've got the three western states, Washington, Oregon, and California, in a new country called Cascadia. You've got, I guess, a lot of red states across the middle of America into the new Republic of the United States. Texas, of course, has to be its own republic. So the Republic of Texas stands on its own. And then in the Northeast, you've got what are being called here the United States. And these are a lot of the blue states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New England states, New York, Virginia, etc. And this is a potentially new map that, and Stephen, I'll let you make the case that I guess, I don't know, how much serious thought is being given to the United States separating into different countries to avert the next civil war?
Well, there's a lot of new interest in secession. About 58% of Trump voting Republicans are in favor of secession, but also 41% of Biden voting Democrats, at least somewhat, support secession. So it's rising, it's growing as an idea. That division that I had there was really about where you see not just the political divisions of red and blue, but also major social divisions. So church attendance, gun ownership, proximity to abortion access, a whole host of corporal punishment in schools, very basic things that are really profound. And, when you look at American politics, it's so easy to see both of these sides in a negative light, like that because of hyperpartisanship, because essentially it's become an attack mode, like their politics is in constant attack mode. But, another way of looking at it is both of these countries have positive visions of political reality. In the southern United States, it would be independence. It would be a basis on traditional family and community participation, as well as government restriction from individual life. And that's a positive vision. Whereas the Northeast also has a positive vision of itself as a multicultural democracy with a great deal of openness and freedom on a different term. So, to me, it's possible to see these two sides at war, but if they were separate, they could actually kind of fulfill their political destiny, which in a sense the United States has kept them from. Right, because they've been trying to negotiate with each other, they haven't really been able to to achieve a full like what would a northeastern seaboard look like with parental leave, real health care, real gun control. I mean, and what would the southern and Midwest look like if it wasn't constantly trying to deal with Washington? These are really interesting political questions. I mean, unfortunately, they'll probably never be asked because secession is more or less constitutionally impossible.
Well, let's not get there yet.
I think it's worth seeing.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
We're thinking
that
about
legally
the differences in a positive way.
Yeah, okay, I take your point. Let me find out from Julie whether she sees anything positive in that map.
So I'm actually somewhat concerned about that map because a lot of the geographic sorting we see in the United States is along the urban-rural divide. So if you take large geographic swaths, like say that middle section of the country, you're actually abandoning a lot of large cities and a lot of communities that could really benefit from a United States of America. So say, as a professor at the University of Mississippi, I know a lot of Mississippians really depend on federal aid. And if we're left in a world where we're kind of divided into red state nation versus blue state nation, what does that mean for local communities? What does that mean for red communities in these new blue areas or bluer communities in red states? So I'm actually kind of concerned that a map like that might force either some people to want to migrate, emigrate, or if they can't afford that, as many people who are not upper middle class, then you're stuck in this mismatch. But I also want to say in some ways, we're already seeing elements of this map because of our federalism system, because we have state and local governments who are increasingly making day-to-day life choices. We see this in terms of mask mandates, vaccine mandates, how individual states and individual counties handle the COVID vaccine. So in some ways, we don't necessarily need a large secession or a large redrawing of boundaries to get a lot of this. Each state kind of treats its people differently in terms of, say abortion access, voting rights access, vaccine access, etc.
Okay, Nate, I wonder whether you think there would be a lot of conservatives in the United States who would simply be happier about being Americans if, for example, California were just its own country, or the New England states or New York were their own country. What do you think?
Well, look, in some ways it would make our lives easier, but that doesn't mean that we should do it. I think Stephen was absolutely right when he said earlier that America is our house. This is our home. This is our country. And we have a duty to preserve and protect it, right? I am not an Oregonian. I'm an American, first and foremost. And, unless Lincoln was wrong about preserving the Union during the Civil War, or unless you think that our divisions now are more significant than they were during the Civil War, where we disagreed about literally whether or not you could own human beings, I think that our situation now is challenging and requires statesmanship, but also is something that actually could be solved rather than by divorce or national secession, which I don't think would work anyways because of the urban-rural divides that were just discussed. We just recommit to the American system of federalism, right? I mean, this is actually the way the American system is supposed to work. It's the genius of the American system of government is the fact that people in Mississippi don't have to live the same way as people in California. There are alternatives, and the way that we actually lower the temperature and cool things down is by dispensing with the idea that everything needs to be done at the federal government, right? Actually, the original sort of constitutional limits on the federal government and the powers enumerated in the states are the best way to solve our national divisions, just to basically recommit to a system in which local communities have more self-determination and the federal government has less say over our lives would be a great way to deal with this without having to deal with some really significant national divorce scenario.
Well, Dylan, as I get your take on this, I guess I should point out that Texas does have a bit of a separatist movement down there. And California is easily one of the top, I think it's what is the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world already. So it's pretty obvious they could exist as their own country, as presumably could New York State. The New England states have precious little in common with the Deep South, other than the fact that they're all Americans. Is the country, in your view, effectively divorcing already?
I don't think so, in a way that I think some of the previous discussion has led up to. As Professor Wronski said, there's actually a great deal of variation from state to state on a lot of these highly contentious policy issues. Low-income pregnant people can get abortions through Medicaid in New York State. They can't in Mississippi. In New York State and California, you are not allowed to own guns with magazines holding more than 10 cartridges. In Mississippi, you can own anything short of a machine gun, basically. And one thing that's been interesting to me is how slight those differences are, despite the fact that our federal system allows a lot more variation. California does not have a single-payer healthcare system akin to Canada's, despite being well to the left of the American public. Mississippi is not a sort of libertarian, no government regime, despite being well to the right of the American median. And I think some of that is that there might be less disagreement over the correct equilibrium than we like to think. If you look at a state like Massachusetts, it's a very liberal state by American standards. They've enthusiastically elected a moderate Republican in the last two elections. Same thing for Vermont, one of the most left-wing states in the United States. And I think it indicates that there's some implicit moderation in American public opinion that we might not be appreciating.
That Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker, who is a moderate Republican, is not standing for re-election because he thinks he's going to be attacked from the right and therefore will not be able to win his nomination back, despite the fact that you're quite right. He's been a popular two-term governor. We're down to our last few minutes. And Stephen, I guess I should give it to you to address the issue of, okay, you've put the thesis out there. Do you think anything can be done short of this divorce, which I suspect you all agree is probably not in the cards? Is there anything that can be done to avert the next civil war?
Oh, just to be clear, like the models here show that the chances of a civil war in the United States are about 70%. Nothing is inevitable. I think it's also worth pointing out that America really is the great country of reinvention. It's the great country of political reinvention. It's the great country of personal reinvention. If anyone can reinvent their politics, it's the Americans. They have the creative capacity to do that in a way that no other country in the world does. But what I would like to say is that the idea that this is all going to work out, that it's going to be like this, the 60s happen and then it's lava lamps and the rest of it, like disco and so on, like the 70s happen, we'll all kind of forget about it. That's not going to happen. This is going one way, and it is really a case of reinvention or fall. Like that, those are the choices, and the questions that are facing America are the largest political questions. They are not, who will get elected in 2024, who will get elected in 2028, who's going to be on it's the questions that face it are: will violence win? Can it survive as a multicultural democracy and remain whole? Can it update a system that's in collapse, which prevents fixing the system as it collapses? These are enormous questions. But if there's anyone who can do it, it's the Americans.
If there's anyone who can do it, it's the Americans. Although I hasten to add Robin Williams' line about, as a Canadian, do you some days feel like living in an apartment over a meth lab?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is sort of like watching your big brother go on a meth binge. It's horrible. Like it's a horrible thing to watch. But yeah, I mean, I don't think we're in any place to lecture since our country nearly broke up twice in my lifetime and we imposed martial law, in living memory. So, it's not like I feel like superior in any way. It's just, and obviously when America, coughs, we catch a cold. So.
Who was it who first said that? I guess it was the current prime minister's father, I think, who once said that, right?
Now,
think
he
so.
said that living next to America was like sleeping next to an elephant. But I prefer Northrop Frye. He said a Canadian is an American who rejects the revolution, which I've always thought is a very nice way of putting it.
That's a nice way to put it indeed. I want to thank Stephen Marche, the author of The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future, for coming onto our program today, and our three other guests from the American Capitol who commented on his book: Julie Wronski, the professor of political science, specializing in political psychology and American politics at the University of Mississippi; Nate Hochman, the ISI Fellow at the National Review, the Novak Fellow at the Fund for American Studies; and Dylan Matthews, the senior correspondent for Vox. Great to have all of you on TVO tonight. Thanks, and let's hope there's no civil war. Can I say that? Am I allowed to be editorial and say that?
Indeed.
Let's hope there's no civil war.
Agreed.
Thanks, everybody.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.